And so as we read the Bible today, we can do so with confidence.
Yeah.
What Bible would you read, and why do you make that choice?
Just personally, what I read at the moment is, when I'm studying the scriptures, I tend to use more than one translation.
Okay.
I would use the English Standard Version. The reason for that is the textual basis for the ESV, I think, accurately reflects as best as possible the original content of the Bible as we have it. And it's important when we talk about the original, the original writings, that we're not necessarily talking about the original manuscript, the autograph, okay? And that's fine. The message of the Bible isn't limited to a single manuscript, okay? It's the message of the Bible can be transmitted in the copying process. And when we say we have access to the original writing or the original text of the Bible, that is from those copies, and that's perfectly fair, and that's a very normal way of reconstructing a text. So the ESV, it would base its text on the very earliest manuscripts. It would use as the basis of it the United Bible Society Fourth Greek Text, which is a very scholarly and reliable text, and the same for the Old Testament. It uses the latest Biblia Hebraica text for that. And so its underlying textual basis is very solid. The philosophy of translation, I think, is very helpful. It's a formal equivalence translation. What that means is, as best as possible, the translators of the ESV seek to render a word-for-word translation as best they can. Sure. Obviously, it isn't a word-for-word translation, because that would be impossible. Just because of the idioms of Hebrew and Greek, it wouldn't make any sense. But they try to be as literal as possible, and that's very helpful for studying the scriptures, to try and read the script as literally as possible. The other translation I use is the New English Translation. Again, it's a very reliable textual Bible, but the translation philosophy is different to the ESV.
Okay.
It is a dynamic equivalent translation, and what that seeks to do is not so much literally translate word for word, but seek to give a thought for thought translation, to unpack the meaning of expressions. I'll give you an example. In Exodus 6, Moses, when he's experiencing the revelation of God at the burning bush, God commissions him to Pharaoh, and he gives this excuse, and in the Hebrew he says, I am of uncircumcised lips, okay? And that's how the ESV translates it, because it's trying to be as literal as possible. What the New English Translation translates that as, it says, I have difficulty in speaking. And that is what Moses is trying to communicate. He's not a confident speaker. It's not that literally he has to circumcise his lips with a knife or something, And so the dynamic equivalent translation seeks to unpack the meaning of the text. And that's something you also see in the ancient translations. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, it translates uncircumcised lips as alogos, meaning lacking verbal fluency. So even the Christians, in the early centuries, using a translation, they would have, had that dynamic translation as well. That's how they would have understood it, that Moses is not a confident speaker. And so I think it's helpful, on the one hand, to try to look at the text as best we can with a literal translation, and on the other hand, to have a translation that helps us to unpack the meaning. And so I would use those translations side by side. I think it helps me an awful lot.
So as you would read, you would not rely exclusively on one translation or even one translation philosophy. Sure. But when you're perhaps preparing to teach or want it to fully grasp it, then you have two Bibles open.
Yeah.
So even you're saying that there's not one Bible, that one English Bible that can express the precise nuances of what you're trying to get across. Is that an accurate way of saying it?
It is, and I think any translation is always subject to correction, and that's an important thing, because a translation of Scripture it's a human effort, and we have to be sensitive to that. That is not a new teaching. That is a teaching that the early church had, with their idea that biblical versions need to be revised and corrected. Okay. The correction of biblical manuscripts was a huge part of a scribe's life.
That's right, yeah.
Even Pamphilius, an early Christian, spent the last, months of his life in prison prior to being beheaded by Diocletian, correcting biblical manuscripts. He was passionate about entrusting as accurate as possible as he could copies of the scripture. And Eusebius tells us that he spent an awful lot of money producing biblical manuscripts to give to the Christian community without charge. He was passionate about getting the word into people's hands, but he also knew that any copy is a human effort, and so it has to be revised and corrected because we are likely to make mistakes. The same is true with an English translation. I mean, the preface to the English Standard Version makes that quite clear, that it's not without, the possibility of revision, because this is a human work. Yeah. But it's done to the glory of God. Yeah. And it seeks to be as accurate as possible.
And hasn't even the English Standard Version, it's already on its second revision, correct?
Correct, yeah.
I mean,
as far as I know.
Well, yeah, I mean,
because we have a different version.
Yours says that, yeah. Now, even with that, there'd be slight differences in wording. I remember in Mark chapter 1, there's a difference in wording with the heavens being torn open. Okay. In my ESV and your ESV.
So good, yeah. And that just shows that people have a proper attitude to the work that they do. Yeah. I mean, some of the most famous biblical translations have had mistakes in them, and that's a fact. I mean, the King James Bible, one of the most famous English translations, in its subsequent reprintings has had some howlers of mistakes. The 1631 edition said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." And the printer who was responsible for that, he was thrown in prison, ended up going bankrupt. Robert Baker, I mean, the copies were burnt. Other revisions of that, there's been some mistakes, like in 1716 in the King James, it said, when the man is healed at the pool of Bethsaida, Jesus comes to him and says, "Be careful and sin on no more." But in the King James in 1716 it said, "Sin on more." And so it dropped that crucial word, And there's other cases, like in 1795 there was a version that said, "Let the little children be killed first instead of filled first." And so there was all these little mistakes. And that just shows that, humans make mistakes. And it's important for us to have the humility to approach our Bible study with that in mind, that we would seek, as Paul says to Timothy, to correctly handle the word of truth and to seek as accurately as possible as we can. And while those mistakes are maybe humorous, they're only quite small, it does show us, that we have to be careful and not be so dogmatic about a certain translation that it is the final say on translation, that it can never be improved. That just goes against church history and even the wishes and views of translators of the scripture. And I guess it even brings us back to where we started with the canon, that these questions of textual criticism, these questions of translation, someone might say, well, why didn't God just keep the original manuscripts for us, I don't know, why didn't he? But the fact is that when you look at this story of the Bible and the story of the preservation of Scripture and the translation and the correction of Scripture, in a sense it is a story of redemption too. That the text has become corrupt over time, certainly, but we have the ability to correct it. We have the ability to study and to redeem it and to get back to the original text. And so I think that's consistent with the way that God works throughout Scripture, and it's nothing that we need to be ashamed of or deny exists. There are certainly, that's just the way that we have been entrusted with Scripture. We need to be careful and to research it and to be diligent.